либо-либо.
You're hearing a bloody clash between several male chimpanzees. And this isn't unusual. Wild chimps are notoriously savage. But chimpanzees are also our closest relatives. Their behavior can help answer questions about our nature. By observing these animals, our first guest today made a series of discoveries about human evolution. How did we work together to build peaceful civilizations while becoming the most effective killers on Earth? You're listening to The Naked Mole Rat, a podcast from Libo Studio. I'm Ilya Kolmanovsky. Hello.
So my name is Richard Wrangham. I'm a research professor of human evolutionary biology at Harvard University.
Richard Wrangham is a world-renowned expert in human evolution. I'm a huge fan of his most recent book. It's called The Goodness Paradox.
Humans have this extraordinary reputation, which is very well deserved, for two contrary features. One is that we are an extraordinarily peaceful, tolerant, like a domesticated animal, because it's pretty rare to see any kind of snarling and aggressive behavior in ordinary life, in day-to-day interactions, where people actually get to fight. It tends to get in the news. So we're very, very gentle in many ways. But on the other hand, we are exceptional killers, particularly in bouts of war, but sometimes in other circumstances. We kill adults of our own species at rates that are very high compared to what any other species does. So the paradox is we are both one of the most tolerant and gentle of animals, and at the same time we're one of the most vicious and lethal of animals.
That is indeed quite a paradox. To understand it better, biologists compared human behavior with that of other primates. Jane Goodall traveled from England to Africa to live among chimpanzees more than 60 years ago. Inspired by her work, many young graduates followed her. Richard Wrangham was one of them. On his travels, he witnessed a dark reminder of our violent evolutionary past.
In the early 1970s, I was in Gombe National Park, where Jane Goodall had launched the study of chimpanzees. And the group of researchers that I was with, it was a wonderful time to be there because it was the first time that any group of people had studied chimpanzees by following them wherever they went in their environment. But over time, they regularly visited the territorial boundaries of the community range. And when they did that, they always did so in company. They never would go there alone, whereas they would often walk alone within the sort of center of the community range. And then they did this extraordinary thing, which was to climb up to a tree where they could look outward from their territory and just sit there and listen. And then they might hear the call of a neighbor. And then they would get very excited with each other. They would touch each other. They would generally remain silent and then creep forwards, stalking forwards as if they were hunting. And it turned out over time that's what they were doing. And when I was there, I saw sometimes they would go forwards stealthily, very, very quietly, and be approaching where they had heard this apparently lone individual calling. And then all of a sudden what turns out to be, well, what was thought to be a lone individual turns out to be several individuals. They hear a volley of calls from that area. And then what do? They immediately turn tail and run back to their own community. So it was clear that what they were doing was looking for the opportunity to attack a lone individual. And then what happened over the next 4 years, from 1974 to 1977, was a series of attacks where our guys consistently attacked males in the neighboring group and eventually wiped out the entire group.
How do they do it?
They get to maybe 5 yards away without being detected, if they're lucky. Then rush forward, and there are always 3 or more males, but typically more like 5 or 6 males attacking at one time. And then they coordinate in a brutal attack. So sometimes you see that they actually hold, one might hold a limb and another might put his weight down on the victim, and then the others do the attacking. An astonishing statistic, which is that in the dozens of attacks that have now been recorded, the attackers have never been hurt beyond a couple of very superficial scratches, even though what they are doing is these very severe attacks that sometimes kill on the spot, and a victim that is 3 or 4 times as strong as a human and is fighting for its life. And so, in other words, they are able to choose a time to attack and a context for attacking when they have very low risk themselves of being hurt.
And what do they do? What, they bite?
Yes, they bite. Sometimes they have bitten the throat so that the throat is torn. Sometimes they bite the testes off. Sometimes there's just a series of bites that lead to bleeding in various parts of the body. Sometimes they will take a limb and twist it until the bones seem to crack and the muscles tear. Sometimes they do kill them on the spot. At other times, the victims crawl away and die 3 or 4 days later.
Did you see it yourself?
I never saw a lethal attack myself. I saw the events leading up to the attack, and I saw a dead body as a result of it afterwards that was crawled away under some bushes, but was unable to feed itself after that.
How did you feel?
I think what one would like to hear is you feel intense compassion for the individuals who are attacked. But you've got to say that one identifies so strongly with the chimps that you're following that you get excited on their behalf. And so what it really comes down to is a feeling of enthusiasm, which is tempered by a guilty conscience for feeling like that. And of course, the fact is that we know the chimps that are doing the attacking, and in general, we don't know the ones that are being attacked. And so you identify with one group and much more than the other.
With your group?
Yeah.
Reflecting on what he had witnessed, Wrangham realized what had struck him so deeply. There was no quarrel, no provocation. The attack was cold-blooded and premeditated. There was only one other animal on Earth capable of doing something like that: humans. Wrangham and other zoologists then began observing various human communities as zoologists. They traveled the world, spending 6 months or a year at a time in each location. Wrangham had grown up in rural England, where the most exciting conflict you'd be likely to see was a Friday night pub brawl. But how did aggression manifest in other societies? There are places in the world where the risk of dying young due to violence is especially high, for example, Papua New Guinea. But during an expedition there, Wrangham discovered 2 things. 1. In Papua, like England, most people are peaceful and cooperative within their social groups. In this way, humans differ dramatically from chimpanzees. And second, at the same time, humans tend to plan, initiate, and carry out brutal killings of members of other groups. In other words, they go to war. This is why young people die in Papua, and even in wealthy countries like the UK, which has certainly had its share of mass casualties over the last century. How do we reconcile humans' low level of aggression within groups with a high level directed at outsiders? So Wrangham suggested, what if these are simply different kinds of aggression? So he divided aggression into 2 types, reactive and proactive. Reactive aggression occurs when there is a quarrel. Maybe someone took something that belonged to someone else, so a fight broke out. Proactive aggression, on the other hand, occurs when there is no quarrel. It's a strategic attack that catches the enemy off guard and incurs as few costs as possible. So Wrangham found that humans have extremely low reactive aggression. This might be hard to believe, especially considering the prison population. Many people end up imprisoned as a result of completely unplanned, spontaneous assaults, often on their own loved ones. But here's how Wrangham sees it.
If we put it into the perspective of chimpanzees, then what we see is that the rate of violence by men towards women is actually relatively low. Male chimpanzees are much worse to the females of their own species than humans are. So I think it's very helpful to put things in comparative perspective.
The same goes for violence between male chimps.
The rate of non-lethal physical violence involving male chimpanzees is several hundred times as frequent as it is in humans. It's between 100 and 1,000 times more frequent. So how is it that humans have escaped the chimpanzee problem, as it were, of being violent both within and between groups?
This very question set off a whole new field of evolutionary science. So for the moment, we will leave Richard Wrangham and visit several very different species, which will help us understand what made humans unique.
Okay. Choice. Good boy. Yay. Yay. You got it.
You're hearing a researcher praise a Labrador puppy. This is at the Duke University Canine Cognition Center. The pup is being commended. He's been correct 100% of the time in guessing which of the two bowls contains food. How does he know? The researcher shows him by pointing. It seems simple, but this experiment offers a completely new perspective on the origins of friendship and of hostility. Next, we have a very special guest who has spent a lot of time studying how animals cooperate and how they fight.
Brian Hare, I am an evolutionary anthropologist and I'm at Duke University. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
Brian Hare has spent years studying animals in the United States, Africa, and Russia. He and his wife, Vanessa Woods, wrote a book called Survival of the Friendliest. It's a play on Charles Darwin's famous phrase about the survival of the fittest.
So we named the book Survival of the Friendliest because we wanted to counter what we view as a major misunderstanding and misconstrual of evolutionary theory and over 150 years of work since Darwin wrote Descent of Man, how evolution has shaped humans. And that misconstrual or misunderstanding, depending on who we're talking about, is that survival of the fittest, which most people are familiar with, it seems to describe in the popular mind that sort of big, strong, alpha individuals are the winners and they should be favored. And that's what evolution and biology always sort of preordain as the winning strategy. And if you take a step back and you look at 150 years of research since Darwin wrote that humans evolved like other species, and you ask, well, what is the big winning strategy in life? The answer is survival of the friendliest. Species that evolve new forms of behavior that allow them to be tolerant or friendly, that then leads to a new form of cooperation.
Most of the time, when two organisms meet, one simply eats the other. But there are plenty of examples of friendly interactions too. There are types of cooperation. One is tolerance, when one simply doesn't mind the presence of the other. That helps with copulation, for example. Another goes beyond tolerance to collaboration. Brian Hare cites a few examples in his book. Flowering plants share pollen with insects. Emperor penguins huddle together for warmth. Ants, the most social of insects, make up 20% of the world's animal biomass. There's also a species of a tiny fish which inhabit coral reefs called cleaner wrasse, which feed on parasites stuck to larger sea creatures, including inside the mouth of predators, without getting eaten. And the crowning achievement of evolution, as we all know, is the naked mole rat, which lives in dense colonies and works for the survival of the colony as a whole. These examples provide an important perspective. Often it is not the most aggressive, but the friendliest that thrives. That brings me back to the Labrador puppy. Brian Hare was given one when he was 8 years old. So he named the dog Oreo. He didn't know then that this was the beginning of his lifelong journey into science.
The only thing that was remarkable is he liked to play fetch with more than one ball. So he always had 2 to 3 balls. If you found him, he just always had more tennis balls than you could imagine could fit in a dog's mouth. And you would throw one of the balls and he would run off and chase it. But of course, as a kid, you'd throw, while he's off getting the first one, you'd throw the other ones. And when he came back, that means he doesn't know where you threw the other one. Of course, I would point in the direction that I'd thrown the ball. And as a retriever, he would go run off kind of in that general vicinity that I gestured towards. And he would orbit around in that area and eventually find the ball.
Brian Hare didn't realize this was unusual until he entered graduate school with the renowned cognitive scientist Michael Tomasello. At the time, it was believed that only humans could understand the pointing gesture.
And I said, well, I think my dog does that. And that was how it all started, promise. And being a good scientist, and this is where you learn what good science is, he was pretty excited, actually, by that. Because, he's like, are you sure? And so I was like, no, really. And I told him the story about how Oreo would play fetch with me. And seeing that I was really serious, he said, well, let's do an experiment. If you're serious, I need to know this, and this could be really exciting.
Consider this. What goes into a pointing gesture? You need to understand something happening in the other's mind. Maybe they have information about where there is food. Pointing is a symbolic gesture. You shouldn't look at the hand or the tip of the finger, but rather visualize a beam emanating from the finger to something the other wants to show you. It's a manifestation of our striving for cooperation and a display of our intelligence. A tremendous amount of effort has gone into understanding how this gesture originated in humans. And yet, here sits a furry canine, tongue lolling, tail wagging, seemingly breaking all the rules. First, Hare and Tomasello had to ensure this wasn't an artifact. They conducted experiments with Oreo, who was fortunately still alive, and then with other dogs. The dogs got it. They got it in a way that even wolf pups didn't. How can this be explained? How did wolves' evolution into dogs lead to a human-like ability to cooperate?
I think it was a population of wolves chose us. We were creating garbage. We were creating a lot of waste that was reliably available. It was easy to obtain.
In the beginning, some wolves, perhaps cautiously and at night, approached those dumps. From that moment onwards, a natural selection process began. These garbage-loving wolves suddenly had access to a large food resource.
Maybe in the beginning it was only at night. You sneak in, you get that really reliable resource. Only individuals with an emotional system and temperament to allow for that attraction and friendliness are going to be able to access that. If you're too afraid, you won't be able to do it. And that's the beginning of our relationship with dogs. So those wolves that could come in and take advantage of that resource, they were in an advantage. That friendliness, attraction to humans, then eventually leads to our cooperative, communicative relationship we have now together with them.
So in wolves, it all began with natural selection for friendliness. So Brian Hare thought this ultimately led to the pointing gesture. Potentially, selection for friendliness could make dogs extremely competent cooperators. To test the theory, Brian Hare was off to Novosibirsk in Siberia. Over 60 years, a population of silver foxes there had been purposefully selected for friendliness by researchers. Sure enough, Brian found that these friendly foxes understood the pointing gesture too, while non-domesticated silver foxes didn't. So he found something else too. The friendlier foxes were less physically developed. They had smaller brains, shorter snouts, and crooked teeth. Researchers call all this domestication syndrome, As a species gets friendly, it also becomes less suited to life in the wild. The same thing happened to wolves as they evolved into poodles and pugs and Frenchies. The same goes too for modern humans with our flat faces and patchy fur. We are more domesticated than chimpanzees. But how and who domesticated us? A clue there comes from another of our closest relatives, bonobos. It turns out bonobo is to a chimpanzee what a dog is to a wolf.
Bonobos have long been suspected to be less aggressive than chimpanzees. So chimpanzees will kill one another. They do have chimpicide, and bonobos have never been observed to kill another bonobo. And female bonobos actually are sort of co-dominant with male bonobos, whereas every group of chimpanzees, you always have a dominant male, an alpha male. So behaviorally, bonobos are friendlier. And then when you look at their bodies, it ends up that bonobos have a change in their bodies. Their faces are sort of shorter. Remember I told you about that shorter snout on the foxes?
So, who domesticated the bonobos? Who selected them for friendliness and sociability?
What we think is it was female bonobos selecting the friendliest males. So if you were a big aggressive male bonobo trying to be alpha and dominant, you were actually at a disadvantage for reproduction. And if there's any male who tries to bully females or anyone in the group really, they will, as the Congolese say, which is where they're found in Congo, the Congolese say they correct them. The females correct the males.
So, female bonobos prefer friendly males. If a male shows aggression, they correct him.
And what that means is one poor male is being chased by like 10 females, and he's bigger than any one female, but he's not going to be able to defend himself against 10 females. And so because the females stick together, the bigger male can never be dominant and can't do the typical alpha male stuff. So it's costly to be aggressive. It's costly to be a big alpha. It takes a lot of energy. It costs your immune system. And then on top of that, if there's no benefit because the females don't allow it, well, that's not going to continue to be favored evolutionarily.
So, friendly males reproduce better, which means that over multiple generations, there are more of them.
And so the friendlier males who weren't being aggressive, who were sitting around not being attacked by females, and it's actually much more relaxing to be friendly, they were at a huge advantage because the females were like, I like that guy. He's not aggressive. And so I want my daughters to mate with him. You know, I prefer this guy. And so the friendly males were at a huge advantage in bonobos. So that's how we think bonobos evolved to be friendlier.
If bonobos truly went down the path of self-domestication as females domesticated males, they should have higher cooperation abilities than chimpanzees. A lab experiment was needed to test this, so Brian Hare went to sanctuaries in the Democratic Republic of Congo where rescued baby chimpanzees and bonobos are rehabilitated and live out their lives. He then ran an experiment.
And so we gave them a problem where basically we put a bunch of food in a bowl that they really, really want. They're hungry and it's really delicious stuff. Imagine like your favorite candy or food, or if it was me, it'd be donuts. I don't really want to share them with anybody. I just want to eat them all. So we asked, if we put their favorite food in one place in kind of a bowl and we let two individuals into the room, so either two bonobos come in together or two chimpanzees come in together, we just asked, can they share the food or not? Or did they try to hog it all and say, no, these are all my donuts and I'm dominant to you and go away? And what we found was that only the bonobos could really share food when it was in one place and in one bowl. Chimpanzees had a really hard time not just trying to take everything.
A simple comparison emerged. When food is placed in a communal bowl, chimpanzees quickly come into conflict while bonobos can share. Because of this, they also solve cooperative tasks very differently.
So then what we did is we took the bonobos and we gave them a problem that they had never solved before, where they had to actually obtain the food. We put it out of reach. They couldn't just reach out and get it. They actually had to obtain it by pulling a rope. And they had to pull two ends of the rope to make the food come forward. But the trick was that the rope was actually kind of like your shoelace. It was threaded through a platform that the food was sitting on. And if you only pulled one end of the rope, you ended up with a rope. If you pull both ends of the rope, well, like your shoelaces, well, the platform would pull forward or your shoes tighten, right? And so they had to cooperate because the two ends were spread too far apart for you to just reach out with both your arms and grab both. So you needed two individuals to solve the problem. So it ends up, we'd never shown this problem to bonobos before. We give them the outer reach food. They have to pull both ends of the rope. Otherwise, it becomes unthreaded. And they immediately run in. They pull the rope. They get the food. Totally unremarkable.
Bonobos excel at this cooperative task right away, even if they aren't familiar with it. With chimpanzees, it's a different story. They can be trained to pull the two ends of the rope together.
But every time when we had done that before, we actually had used 2 bowls of donuts or 2 bowls of food. So if you were successful pulling that platform forward with the ropes, you got your own reward bowl. And so you get yours, I get mine, and you just have to be tolerant and friendly enough to let the other guy get their reward that's clearly theirs. And the chimpanzees can do that. But what happened was when we put it all in one bowl, even though they had so much experience and they understood so much about the problem, they fell apart. They couldn't do it.
Let me reiterate, it's not necessarily that bonobos are smarter. It's that their willingness to cooperate enables the evolution of complex behaviors. In the case of humans, scientists believe our same capacity for friendliness helped us outlive other species. We became friendlier towards strangers that we identified as being part of our own group. How did this happen and what did we gain from it? There were once several species of humans on Earth. We are the only ones left.
We can see someone we've never met before and immediately realize, oh, you share part of my identity, and therefore I will treat you as if you're part of my group. And potentially I can bond with you and become as concerned with you as I do my own family.
And together, human groups develop norms. We cook this way, we speak that way, we wear our clothes like this. That's not just because we belong to the same species, that's too broad. And it's not because we're related, that's too narrow. It's because we recognize others, even strangers, as part of our group. And here lies the uniqueness of humans, according to Brian Hare. Chimpanzees hate unfamiliar chimpanzees. Bonobos, on the other hand, have an automatic friendliness toward unfamiliar bonobos. Modern humans are somewhere in between. We can share and solve problems together, but we are capable of violence. We do kill, and we do wage wars. We don't have an immediate hatred of other people, even if we don't know them, but we could develop that hatred. For us, the key is a group identity, determining if a stranger is one of us, and this becomes crucial.
Now, humans, obviously, we respond to familiarity. We share that with chimpanzees and bonobos, but mapped on top of that is this group identity. So we see somebody we don't know, and we say, I don't know you, I'm unfamiliar with you. But then the next thing we do is we say, I got to figure out, am I going to be afraid or attracted to you? And what we use to make that determination is identity.
If the stranger is not one of us, if they come from a group that poses a danger to us, that's a whole different ballgame. In this way, our violence and our friendliness are two sides of the same coin. In fact, Richard Wrangham, from the beginning of this episode, thinks understanding our friendliness lies in uncovering some of the darkest sides of our aggression. He looks back at hunter-gatherer societies. Occasionally, group stability was threatened by one particularly violent member. How did the group handle that person?
And the answer is that after efforts to persuade them in nice ways not to be excessively violent, in other words, by talking to them, by laughing at them, by ostracizing them, by, in other words, using methods that are not violent, after that, the record in small-scale societies is completely clear, and that is that eventually the community comes together and says, this guy is so appalling and he's so reluctant to abandon his violent ways. You know what we got to do? We got to kill him. And they kill him. Now, it happens in all sorts of different ways, but the effect is always the same. There is execution that is approved by the community and is done in ways that try and minimize any kind of knock-on effects of his family defending him by killing the killers. Nowadays, in our society, we have prisons, and that's what we do with them. So that observation can then be taken back to say, well, why don't chimps do that? And I think the answer is very clear. Chimps are incapable of having the kind of conversations that mean that you can organize a killing in a way that is safe for the community, is safe for the killers, and achieves its job of getting rid of an excessively violent individual. And so the very simple theory really is that it was at the point when human ancestors developed sufficiently sophisticated language that they could coordinate in this very complicated way of saying, look, I think we really need to do something about this appalling man. It was when they got that language that they were able to kill people. They were able to kill the violent members of their own group. Now, who would their violent members be? They were the top males. They were the alpha males who used their violence to get what they wanted. And what did they want? Well, of course, they wanted both male status, but they also wanted to have access to as many females as possible. So what we're talking about is the time when there was first an evolutionary switch from this kind of aggression being favored and leading to lots of babies and evolutionary success for those individuals, to being strongly selected against because it meant that you and probably your sons and your daughters and your other members of your family would be killed. And this dramatic switch can, I think, now be recognized in the fossil record, because in the fossil record, we see a time when selection begins to happen against the kind of aggression that we're talking about.
At a certain point, a harsh selection against reactive aggression kicked in within human groups. That peace was enforced through proactive aggression. This leads to what Wrangham calls the goodness paradox. Virtue arose, strengthened, and flourished, relying on a new and deeply unsettling form of cruelty. Essentially, let's live in harmony by killing the bad people. But living in harmony came at a cost. Remember our flat faces and patchy fur. It's domestication syndrome. We became less physically capable of reactive violence.
The changes that happen are recorded in the bones, and they are 4 main types of change. And those 4 main types of change are seen in the origin of Homo sapiens and in the evolution of Homo sapiens after its origin. So that suggests that what we're seeing with the origin of Homo sapiens is the ability of humans to use sufficiently sophisticated language to get rid of these aggressors, and in the course of doing that, to become like a domesticated animal, to become self-domesticated.
And what are these 4 traits?
The first is the face becomes shorter and the teeth become smaller. The second is that the animal becomes generally a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter boned. It becomes more gracile than robust. The third is that there is a reduction in the degree of maleness in the species, and particularly what you see is that the degree of differences between males and females become reduced. So it's the male aggression that is particularly being selected against, because it's the whole male syndrome that is being selected against. And then finally, it's the reduction in the size of the brain. And of course, people tend to be very surprised about the notion that humans have undergone a reduction in the size of the brain. And that is very surprising because it goes against a general trend for the brain to substantially increase over the whole of the last 2 million years. But this is a late change in humans, but in the period from 30,000 years ago onwards, we see a loss of about 10% of the brain size in Homo sapiens. And that's happening at a time when the bones are becoming lighter as well. So the fact is that it conforms, the 4th great signature of a domesticated animal compared to a wild animal, and the human story conforms to that complete signature.
That never ceases to amaze me. We begin selecting individuals with the lowest reactive aggression. After several millennia, we arrive at the desired result, but we also end up with 4 other traits that are unrelated to what we were selecting for. Why is that? Biologists have a nuanced answer. Our body is assembled like a Lego figurine following genetic instructions. So Richard Wrangham and his colleagues propose a hypothesis. When the embryo is still the size of a grain of rice, a ridge of specialized cells forms along its back, known as the neural crest. Some of these cells will eventually form the spinal cord, but not all of them. Other cells will affect other parts of the body. For example, one of the roles of these neural crest cells is to form the pigment of an animal's fur. In domesticated animals, not all neural crest cells reach their destination, especially in the extremities. Thus, a white tip on the tail, white socks on the legs, or a white spot on the forehead. Another thing that happens in domesticated animals is a slower development of the brain.
And the big effect is that it leads to a reduced rate of emotional development. And the multiple smaller effects that are unpredictable in any particular individual, ones that lead to things like the white patches of fur, they lead to smaller populations of neural crest cells promoting the development of the brain. They lead to less cartilage in the ears, which allows the ears to be floppier. So dogs have floppy ears much more often than wolves do. The only wolves that have the floppy ears are the pups. So a whole series of intriguing ways in which a reduced rate of migration or total population size of neural crest cells can lead to the syndrome, the traits that we see in the domestication syndrome.
What does it do to the brain itself?
The brain is not derived from neural crest cells, but the brain is greatly affected in its growth by proteins that are produced by neural crest cells. And so the idea is that a reduced population of cranial neural crest cells leads to reduced production of factors promoting brain growth, and therefore a reduced rate of brain growth, so leading to juvenilization of the brain. That may be too simple a concept. We haven't got very far with that yet, but it is one intriguing possibility.
And how does the reactive aggression change due to that change in neural crest cells?
One very important component would appear to be the specifics of what's going on in the limbic system, the sort of emotional part of the brain. The amygdala is a pair of little parts of the brain that is very much involved in aggression. It is apparently smaller in domesticated species than wild species, although that's not absolutely uniform. But it looks like that could be one important component. So maybe these changes in the brain that are brought about by neural crest cells might be responsible for actually changing the neural pathways involved in the production of aggression. But this is all, very speculative. We don't know exactly how that works at the moment. Is testosterone production important in this? Because testosterone does seem to be important in the production of reactive aggression, more so perhaps than proactive aggression.
Interesting, very interesting. And also the fear reaction is also involved, right?
Yes, aggression and fear, of course, are very closely related to each other. And it's kind of complicated because in some ways what you see with domesticated animals is that they are less fearful and therefore less aggressive. But in other ways, they are sometimes more fearful because they run away to the point where they get less likely to be involved in an aggressive confrontation.
A domesticated animal resembles its wild ancestor but appears more infantile. A similar thing happened with Homo sapiens. Wrangham has said that about 30,000 years ago, a significant leap in human domestication occurred. faces became more flat and brain volume dropped by 10%. Sapiens were not domesticated by some aliens. We were domesticated by our own groups. On the cover of the book, The Goodness Paradox, there is an angel with a sword. This angel represents the alliances of male individuals who began to mete out justice to those who exhibited reactive aggression.
These signatures of a domesticated form compared to a wild ancestor begin 300,000 years ago, and then it's as if they accelerate in the more recent periods. And of course, we know that there were dramatic changes happening in humans, in sapiens, in that sort of era 30,000 years ago, because our relationship with the Neanderthals changed shortly before that. So, many times, or several times, Homo sapiens had met with Neanderthals from more than 100,000 years ago onwards without having any kind of dominating effect. And then about 43,000 years ago, sapiens knocks again on the door of the Neanderthal habitat, as it were, in southeastern Europe. And then all of a sudden, whoosh, everything changes. And the sapiens come marching through and they take over. And within 3,000 years, the Neanderthals have disappeared altogether.
Why was that?
Well, the obvious possibility is that the degree of cooperation that the sapiens had achieved at that point became such that they were able to completely outcompete the Neanderthals. And the obvious possibility, again, is that they were very effective in war, that they were very effective in using weapons, probably bows and arrows of some kind, and cooperating. I mean, they appear from that point onwards to have been living in substantially larger groups than Neanderthals ever did. So one way or another, they outcompeted them. Violence seems very likely to have happened.
So, as soon as sapiens domesticated themselves enough to tolerate each other, they learned to live in larger groups of about 200 individuals. And the first thing these new flower children did was sweep through the world like fire, destroying all other species of Homo, not just the Neanderthals.
And that was the point at which a moral conscience starts developing, because the killing that was done by those male coalitions, which I call the Alpha Alliance, the killing by the Alpha Alliance enabled the Alpha Alliance to impose norms on the rest of the group. And those norms were, most importantly, things that were good for the group, like you help others when they're in time of need. You do not take other people's possessions, if they have possessions. You do not rape. You do not impose violence on others. And these kinds of norms would rapidly lead to the evolution of a conscience. So that's why I think that until you had selection against reactive aggression and manifested in the existence of an Alpha Alliance, everyone was a psychopath. And now what we see in the 1%, say, of the population that are judged to be psychopathic nowadays is the dwindling remains of our ancestral population. So this would be the culmination, as it were, of the process of self-domestication that made us tolerant, loving, cooperative, investing in each other within the groups, while never losing the ability, like chimpanzees have, to coordinate in attacks on members of other groups of our own species, or in that case, other groups of another species, Neanderthals.
Not only did we retain that ability, but we also magnified it many times over. We were becoming better at coexisting within groups. We showed increasing tolerance toward everyone, even strangers, enough to consider them one of us. And at the same time, each generation used new technologies to kill as many outsiders as possible. Reactive aggression gradually moved to the background, but proactive aggression continued to grow. What does that all mean for our prospects for peace on the planet? Are we doomed to forever go to war with each other?
Remember I said that among chimpanzees, you've got this astonishing statistic that in all of the attacks that have led to deaths of their neighbors, the attackers have never been hurt. Why? Because they judge to be able to do it in a way that they can attack without being hurt themselves. Well, if we were going to think optimistically about humans, we would say that proactive aggression can be controlled because the aggressors should always be in a position where those that they wish to attack would be able to impose sufficient punishment on the attackers that the attackers would judge it not to be worth it. Of course, that's complicated when you have a leader who is willing to sacrifice members of his own country if he himself is not going to be hurt. And that happens, as we know.
So essentially, Richard Wrangham says here that people go to war easily when they see an external threat. They could be deterred by potential defeat, but such deterrents don't work on a leader who feels impunity. Richard Wrangham doesn't have a solution for war to solve proactive aggression. But what if we can continue to tamp down on our reactive aggression? Might all aggression fall with it? For instance, in the future, we may discover genes that influence the behavior of neural crest cells, and thus the degree to which a person is domesticated or aggressive. If by then a reliable method to edit embryos emerges, will humanity edit these genes to enhance virtue? I'm certainly not an advocate for eugenics, but some advocates for gene editing ask, if we can influence our own suffering, do we have the moral right to refuse to do so?
I don't think we're anywhere near the state where a eugenics approach is appropriate. We should not think that our current state is the one we're going to have in the future. To me, the really big problem is the Y chromosome, much more than some individuals, because even the level of self-domestication that we have got to still leaves males as a serious problem in terms of visiting violence on the rest of the species. If we could just wave a magic wand and get rid of males altogether, I think that would give a much more optimistic future for the species as a whole. But of course we can't, because the whole process of making the Y chromosome extinct would be itself be fraught with conflict.
So you would get rid of Y chromosome, but keep sexual reproduction, right? In order to continue the crossing over and continue to have that Y diversity. You wouldn't switch to cloning, right? Because you don't want asexual reproduction, because then you would not have much diversity.
Yeah, no, I mean, in order to protect against diseases, and probably for other reasons as well, some kind of sexual reproduction would indeed be a good idea. But I don't see why, in theory, you need to have a Y chromosome for that. The technology of the future may enable females to breed with each other.
Yeah. But you or I wouldn't exist in that world. Are you fine with that?
Well, we're not going to anyway.
How do you feel about it? But the likes of you.
And as males, I got no particular attraction to maleness just because of the fact that I happen to be a male. I'm thinking about the species as a whole. And from the point of view of the species as a whole, I think the Y chromosomes are dangerous. So I embrace the notion that we would be able to survive as a consequence of a real advancement. But I've no idea how it could happen.
If Wrangham is suggesting editing out the Y chromosome to deal with reactive aggression, Brian Hare has an idea for how to deal with proactive aggression. Be like bonobos. Eat from the same bowl as your enemy. He thinks members of the US Congress, for example, urgently need to start eating from the same bowl, literally.
My solution is really, really simple. My immediate solution is Congress is actually mostly 20-year-olds. Few people know this, that the Senate and the House of Representatives are run by 20-year-olds, and it's all the staffers. And most of them are paid nothing. Many of them volunteer. Of course, there's the representative that was voted for, but they have an office full of people working. Most of those people are 20 years old, in their 20s. And they are living in the most expensive city almost in the world, paid almost nothing, and they're doing it for the love of their country, and they have aspirations to be future politicians, judges, and lawyers that are going to be deciding the future of our country. My biggest fear would be that those people that are in their 20s right now are being taught to dehumanize the other side, because we're setting ourselves up for the future where Putin or a Putin-like figure could be very successful.
But these are young people living in a very expensive city while earning little. Brian Hare's solution is free lunch, conditional on staff from both parties participating.
And so that group of people, they will naturally, at that age, form friendships, realize that the differences aren't that great. And when push comes to shove, you'll have a group of people who, no, that's my friend you're talking about. We used to go to lunch. We're not going to, commit violence against them. Like, we're going to have another way to do this. We're going to have another way forward.
So Brian Hare believes free food should go into one pot. I didn't ask who should pay for that food because I got distracted wondering whether such a pot might have existed in Russia when I grew up in the 90s as liberals and conservatives tore the country apart. Maybe it was too late for Russia already, but is it too late for the rest of the world? This is The Naked Mole Rat, a podcast from Libo Studio. It is produced by Andrey Borzenko, Ilya Marritz, Danil Astapov, Anastasia Medvedeva, and Lika Kremer. Our sound editor is Ildar Fattakhov. I'm Ilya Kolmanovsky. Goodbye.